Some of the stories you're about to hear may be true. Some of them might even frighten you. Whatever you do, be careful of your brothers and sisters. My brothers, they're a bit older than me. One day we were all sitting down on our dock fishing. The oldest brother picked up a knife out of a tackle box. Immediately, something inside of me triggered. I wasn't sure what caused it. Maybe it was instincts, or maybe it was the presence of evil that loomed itself over that dock. My brother kept looking at the knife. Holding it up to the sky, he examined it with the glare of the sun reflecting off of it. Whatever it was about this knife, it excited him. You see, my brother had always been a little strange. He often read dark novels, and he was always intrigued by the occult. Anytime we watched a series where there would be some type of sacrificial ceremony, he'd always have to comment on it, on the lack of realism or the very unauthentic tools. So, I've always been used to him having strange fascinations with random objects. But this time was different. The knife was brand new and used for killing and cooking fish. As soon as he lowered the knife, the most horrific thing I had ever seen to this day happened. He looked at my other brother and went, I wonder how sharp this is. Without hesitation, he stabbed it into the top of my middle brother's thigh. As my middle brother screamed in both pain and fear, my oldest brother just looked at the knife casually. He then gave a, as if he was surprised that it didn't go deeper. His attitude about the whole situation still creeps me out till this day. I've seen many horror shows in my life, but none of those films hold a candle to what my brother did to me. When we were younger, he used to scare the crud out of me. My parents, they just thought it was kids being kids, but as we got older, it got worse. He used to walk out of the kitchen with a knife and just stare at me. My parents, they would never really believe it when I told them. As we continued to grow older, he became more violent. He would pull my hair and pin me down to the ground. Sometimes when he held me down, he would just start slapping me all over my body. As a small girl weighing less than 120 pounds, there wasn't much I could do. But he eventually turned down the violence and grew a little more touchier. He would do this thing where he would brush up against me just to touch my lower back. At first, I thought it was just an accident, but he just kept going lower. Eventually, I caught on, and I always told him to stop, but he didn't. When I turned 18, I found a hidden camera in my bathroom. I instantly knew it was his. I took it and took out the SD card. I put both of them inside my room. Here's where things get even creepier. 2 days later, the camera and the SD card went missing from my room, and my brother started doing some very strange things at night. Every night, he would pace up and down our hallway. Most nights only for a few minutes, but sometimes he liked to knock on my door, or he would just stare at me when I was going into my room. Right now, I'm in the process of sweeping my room for cameras because I still have no idea how he found all of his stuff. I was completely lost on what to do. But about 5 months ago, everything changed. I was lying in bed one night trying to get a good night's rest before my exams the next day. I kept tossing and turning for hours. It was almost impossible to sleep. It was closing in on midnight and I was finally starting to zone out. That's when I heard it. The creak of my bedroom closet. It sent shivers up my back. I kept my eyes shut and I didn't move a muscle. That's when I felt it. The cold touch of a hand on the back of my thigh. I knew it was him. He gently rubbed his hand against my leg and I was petrified. Still to this day, I don't know how he got into my closet without me knowing. Honestly, he had to have been there for almost 5 or so hours, just sitting there, watching me through the cracks of the double doors. My brother moved in close to my face I could feel his warm breath against my cheek. I held back tears. At this point, though, I didn't know how to react. I was terrified. "If you tell Mom, I'll kill you." My eyes shot open and my heart pounded. Slowly, he crept out of my room like a snake. He was careful to not allow the lock on the door to make a sound. As soon as I heard the door squeeze shut, I darted out of bed and locked it. The panic I felt still affects me, and I can't even look at my brother now. I need to leave this house. My brother is 5 years older than me. When he turned 12, my folks trusted him to watch me when they went out for short trips to the store. When I was about 8, I got into a terrible fight with him, and that night was the night that I almost died. I think it started with something stupid. I wanted to watch a movie, and he wanted the living room and the TV to watch something that was scary. He told me to F off upstairs to my room. We almost always came to blows over everything. His reactions to the arguments were to always get inches from my face and scream as loud as he could, and puff up to intimidate me. This was something he obviously got from our father. He then would put his hands on you if you stepped up to him, and I often did, and as I started to do with my father as well. That night, we started screaming at each other, and he slapped me across the face. I was so shocked, I fell on my ass and looked at him in disbelief. He'd hit me so hard that he split my upper lip. I started to cry, and I said I was going to call our grandmother. As soon as I stood up to run for the phone, he grabbed me by the collar of my shirt and tried to keep me away from the phone. I screamed and tried to push him away, but he grabbed my hair with his other hand and forced me into the ground. He was behind me. His arms shifted into a bear hug, his legs wrapped around mine, and I couldn't move. I felt his arm shift and one of his forearms went around my neck and his opposite hand collapsed over my mouth and then my nose. I tried to scream, but nothing. I couldn't even breathe. I clawed at his arms and kicked my legs, but I found they couldn't budge. Then I blacked out. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor and realized that I had peed myself. I remember feeling so ashamed of that later. I felt so tired and sore, but I looked up and saw my brother sitting on the couch watching his movie and completely ignoring me. He had unplugged the 2 phones he had and had them in his lap. I couldn't move for a long time, and I remember just laying there, hurting in my lungs, crying, but quietly because I felt like my chest was broken. He didn't even look at me, but he said if I told my mom or dad, he would shoot me. I eventually crawled into the kitchen and walked up the stairs, slipped out of my wet clothes, and fell into bed and went to sleep. I never told my parents. He's now 38 and beat me many more times after that incident, but never quite that bad. He's a deadbeat dad currently in prison for his 5th DUI. He's never really had a job for more than a few months. He lies, cheats, steals, and my dad, still to this day, loves him to death. I really don't think I ever loved my brother. My twin sister Anna got married to her fiance Josh a few days ago. Anna and I have always been inseparable. She's my best friend. I was over the moon when Anna told me that she was engaged. When she asked me to be her maid of honor, I was almost as happy as when I heard she was getting married. On the day of the wedding, I had a doctor's appointment and went straight to the church from there. When I arrived, I met up with the other bridesmaids. I was surprised to see they weren't wearing pink dresses like Anna had picked out. Instead, they were all wearing long, black dresses. I was still wearing jeans and a blouse, and Lillian, one of Anna's friends, asked rudely, "You're going to change, right?" I told her of course I was. I brought my dress with me. When I got back in my dress, they all looked at me in shock. Lillian snapped at me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I was confused. Though I was supposed to be the maid of honor, the bridesmaids would not let me talk to Anna at all. Instead of being with my sister on her wedding day, I had to sit at the back of the church. When we arrived at my parents' house for the reception, everyone was acting strange around me, like I had done something really wrong. Every time I tried to talk to someone, they just left me standing there. Some people even seemed to look at me pitifully for some reason, but they still wouldn't talk to me. The worst thing was that Anna kept avoiding me. She looked really gloom, which was really strange because she'd been looking forward to getting married for so long. She seemed to be making her rounds, but I never really saw her talking to anyone. I finally decided to confront her. I told her that I was really sorry about the dress, but she hadn't told me about the change and I didn't know what I was doing wrong. She didn't answer, but looked at me with a look of disdain that she'd never given me before. I then asked her why she wasn't with Josh and whether anything had happened between them that was upsetting her. She told me, "I'm not here for Josh, I'm here for you." I don't really have any idea what that was supposed to mean. There is one thing, though, that happened a few days before the wedding that I should mention. Anna, she didn't really want to have a bachelor party, but her, me, and a couple of her friends went to get drinks. That evening, I really messed up. I was more tipsy than I realized, and I ended up crashing Anna's car. Fortunately, nothing major happened. Anna only got a few scratches and I bumped my head pretty badly, but other than that, we didn't really have any injuries. She was really mad at first, but I thought she would have gotten over it by the wedding. My parents, though, were really mad at me for the accident. They cried a lot after the police told them what had happened. I think they were really disappointed in me. Josh came over that night too, and even he cried. I think he was really upset that my sister got hurt, even though her injuries weren't that bad. I still feel really guilty about drinking and driving, and maybe the accident is the reason everyone is acting so weird around me. Maybe Anna's still mad about it, but I feel she could have told me that instead of not telling me about the change to the dresses. The worst thing happened after I went to bed after the reception. I'd just fallen asleep when Anna came into my room. She was still wearing her wedding dress. The white fabric almost seemed to glow in the darkness of my room. There were dark stains on her dress. By the look of it, she had spilt red wine. I think she must have been drunk because she started talking about how I ruined everything, and how she would make me regret it for the rest of my life. Her face was distorted with rage. It almost looked unhuman. I was shocked. Her voice also sounded weirdly raspy. But she's a stress smoker, so I just assumed that she had been smoking a pack before she came into the room. I started crying and asked her what she meant by all of this. She let out an unearthly shriek. She raised her hand as though she was going to hit me, and I instinctively closed my eyes. But she must have missed because all I could feel was a passive cold air. When I opened my eyes again, she had left. I woke up several times during the night and heard her wailing every time. Not just crying though, wailing. The next night, she suddenly stood next to my bed. She was just standing there, wailing and showing me no reaction when I tried to talk to her. Since all of this started, she's come to my room almost every night. Every time, she wears her stained wedding dress. And I really don't know why she's tormenting me. I've been meaning to talk to her about it during the day, but she's always at her husband's house. I told my parents about her behavior, but they refused to talk with her. They even started to tell me that I was imagining things. They said that I had to understand that Anna was not here anymore. I told them that I knew that she lived with Josh in their new apartment, but she obviously came to our house every night. Tonight, I don't want to go to bed. To be honest, I'm terrified of my sister. This story isn't too long, but it's one of the only things that gives me goosebumps when I think back on it. Back when my youngest sister was around 5 or 6, My mom, my sister, and I were upstairs watching some TV series. Out of nowhere, my sister turns to my mother and says, as vividly as I remember in these exact words, "Mommy, do you remember when I was in your tummy and I died and it made you sad? But it's okay now because I'm back and you're happy." I looked up at my mom and she was pale and holding back tears. Something that my parents had only ever told me as the eldest child. The year before my youngest sister was born, my mom had a miscarriage. I promise you, I've never told anyone about this before. Now, I'm not religious, and as much as the supernatural stories interest me, I don't really believe in the paranormal. But many kids say random things, and I can't explain that day away. The chills I got from my sister so calmly speaking about her life before, it really makes me think about things. This story isn't as scary as others, but I think it fits the theme well. One day after school in ninth grade, I went across the street to my friend's house. In those days, even though we had only known each other since the summer before, it was pretty normal for me to just walk over to her house, come in without knocking, and hang out. I was known and well liked by the whole family. Her parents were friends with my mom, and she had a handful of siblings to include an older brother that was tall and fat. The day of the incident, he was the only one home. He came across as a bit weird, but generally a sweet and introverted guy. I, meanwhile, was 14, small for my age, not yet 5 feet tall and under 100 pounds, and completely lacking any physical strength or skill. I wasn't naive, but I was pretty reckless. I was still kind of awkward from my preteen years, but had recently cut my hair short, dyed it blonde, and was wearing my favorite pair of pants. Skin-tight, zipper-covered black jeans that made my butt look great. He explained that his sisters were out walking the dog, so I went into the room that the girls shared to play with their kittens and waited for them. I sat down on my friend's bed, looking around the room for the kittens, and he silently entered the room behind me and sat down right next to me. I was a bit creeped out, so I got up and moved to the older sister's bed, and he followed, again without saying a word. Playing dumb, I cheerfully wondered aloud if the kittens were under the beds, and so I got up and crouched down on the floor to look. Unfortunately, I didn't realize what sort of view that would give him. He stood up, walked up right behind me, and mumbled, "Your butt looks great in that." I froze up, though I was more embarrassed than scared, and said, Thank you. I like these pants." "Can I touch it?" he asked. Without hesitating or explaining, I just simply said, "No." Then I continued looking, hoping that he would just go away if I ignored him. There was a long pause, and then he moved closer. He reached toward me. "I'm gonna touch it anyway." I turned around, looking up at him with my big blue eyes, and in the most innocent, genuine expression I could muster on my 14-year-old face, I softly said the first thing that came to my mind, which was, "If you put one hand on me, I will rip off your junk and shove it down your throat." He stopped dead in his tracks, then edged towards the door, muttering, "I have to go. Don't tell my sister about this." "Okay," I said, and then without breaking eye contact, I pulled out my cell phone, calling his younger sister. I told her the entire story with him standing there, staring at me. He gave me a murderous look, but left the room. When she got home, the two of us and the older sister gave him a massive amount of crap for it, and he never tried anything again. My little sister was only 7 when they buried her. I had very vague knowledge of ghosts back then, most of which came from my grandmother. My mother had discouraged her from talking about it, but her mother was more stubborn than her. Consequentially, The intricacies of the supernatural, as narrated by my grandma late in the nights, are some of my earliest memories. We lived in a decent sized house back then, but there were a lot of us. My mom, my dad, my grandma, my uncle on my father's side, and 3 cousins of my mother. Then there was me and my sister, before they found her dead in a ditch in the rain. I had seen her lying there, but was too young to understand the vicious slashes all over her neck and back, and the bloody indentations in her skull. I remember distinctly my dad holding me against his chest, the tears streaming down his cheeks like a floodgate that had opened, as his body shook with the sobbing. Turning my head, my hair dripping wet in the humid rain, I looked to see the droplets of rain as they bounced off my sister's corpse and slid coldly over the grooves of her back. She didn't seem to mind. She started to visit me at night soon after that. It gradually became routine for me to leave my bedroom window open so she could climb in and sit on the floor and watch me as I slept. Sometimes she woke me up, and we had conversations about other children we knew, or school, or what my grandmother had cooked that day. Her face was in a terrible state, her eye especially, one of them an empty socket and the other was cold and distant. But she had such a warm voice, and she was my sister, and to this day, I choose to believe that she loved me as I loved her, even after she came back. She looked like a corpse, but she talked to me like a sibling, and that was enough for me. The court never found evidence about who did that to her, who threw her in the ditch on that dismal night. But as time went on, my sister started hinting to me that my uncle was somehow involved. He was the only one living with us at that point. So my uncle became a bigger presence in my everyday life, and I began to grow frightened of him. This wasn't that long ago, and back then I had never really heard of the stranger with the lollipop mythos, if you catch what I mean. And in that culture I was so innocent, and I just didn't understand what my sister was trying to get at. That is, until one night, she explained it all. She told me everything, every little thing that my uncle had done to her, and then she just left in silence. To my child's mind, things seemed to fall into place. I thought I understood. What my sister wanted was revenge. The first time I had a golden opportunity, I took it. As my uncle took me for a walk along a cliff over the sea, the first time he turned his back, I gathered all my strength and kicked him in the back of the knees. I still remember the expression on his face as he buckled and toppled over the side. As I saw his skull smash onto the jagged rocks, his neck twisted like gelatin, and red blood went everywhere. I lay there crying until the police came, although I never regretted it for a second. That night, my parents wanted me to sleep in their room, but I convinced them to let me go back to bed in my own room because I wanted to see my sister. That night, she didn't come until I had already fallen asleep. I was woken up by the sound of screaming. As my eyes flickered open, I saw her on her knees on the floor of the bedroom. Her fingers were reaching for my chest, screaming at my face. She was a mess, her veins bulging, blood leaking from her wounds. "What have you done?" As I watched, she screamed and sobbed and tore at her own flesh. It was so shocking that I ended up blacking out. I never understood the horrible thing that I had done to my own sister. That is, until we went to the churchyard after the funeral. They buried my uncle right next to her. I never saw my sister again. My brother and I used to be so close. We were 2 years apart. My brother Ryan was the oldest, and I was the youngest. Throughout both of our childhoods, we were inseparable. We played and hung out together all the time. Things were good. It all changed when I turned 11, when I was diagnosed with leukemia. From what I've heard, Ryan was practically forgotten by my family. My parents constantly visited me in the hospital, staying by my side during the majority of my chemotherapy. Even when they were at home with Ryan, they still only thought and talked about me. I remember my brother's face as he saw me in the hospital bed. The first time he saw me, he looked distraught. It must have been hard seeing your own sibling in a state like this. As more and more visits went on, the expression on his face had changed. His face looked hard to read, almost like he had something on his mind. I didn't think much of it at the time. Thankfully, I quickly went into remission and have been cancer-free for around 5 years now. The whole family was thrilled, including Ryan. Not long after I was released from the hospital, my parents revealed to us that they were having troubles financially. This resulted in both of them needing to go back to work. I was 11 and my brother was 13, so they trusted us to be home alone. I'll never forget Ryan's face when they told us. He looked crushed. It was from then on that our relationship seemed to change. Ryan became distant and withdrawn. He was quicker to anger, and he didn't seem to want me to be around. At the time, I figured it was part of him becoming a teenager. While this behavior continued for the next 5 years, it was only around 3 months ago when his behavior began to get really strange. It started after he finished his senior year of high school. Once summer break began, he started spending much more time in his room. His bedroom was in the basement of the house, so he always had privacy. Not long after school ended, I began to notice some odd signs. I remember sitting on the couch, watching television. Ryan wasn't home, and my parents were out working. When Ryan came back, though, he was carrying some sort of container. I couldn't tell what was inside, since it was covered in a white sheet. I asked him what it was, but he told me loud and clear that it was none of my business. He brought the mysterious containers downstairs into his bedroom. Then he came back up and grabbed some more from his car. He kept doing this for a couple trips, and at this point I was extremely curious, but I didn't want to upset him. Once he finished retrieving the containers, he went back to his car and returned with some more stuff. This time, he came back with many bags of food and bottled water. All of the foods were non-perishables, mostly canned goods. Finally, he went downstairs and locked the door. I was confused, but I wasn't very concerned. It wasn't until the end of the next day when I actually started to get a little bit worried. He still hadn't come out of his room, not once. Eventually, my parents got concerned too. They tried to open the door, but Ryan convinced them to not worry. He told them that he was an adult and that he had plenty of food and water to take care of himself. They gave in, not wanting to argue after a long day of work. I, however, refused to give up. Every day, I tried to convince him to get out, but he always yelled at me to go away. Finally, about a month later, I gave up. Another month went by, and Ryan still hadn't left his room. None of us tried to get him out, since we knew he would just end up yelling at us. During the night, my mind would often wander and think about Ryan. As time went on, my thoughts became more and more paranoid, and I began to get worried. It was around the 2-month mark when I decided enough was enough. I woke up early that morning, and I couldn't fall back asleep. My parents were working, and it was just me and Ryan at home. I silently crept down the stairs and walked towards the door to Ryan's room. I knocked gently. Silence. I knocked harder, but still no response. I tried calling his name, but I got nothing. Eventually, I was banging at the door, and then I started to get really scared. I put my ear to the door and noticed something weird. I heard a noise that sounded like a muffled buzzing sound. I finally got to the point where I decided to force my way in. I went into the garage, got a baseball bat, and went back to his door. I hit the door again and again, and eventually a crack opened. Once that hole broke open, I was hit with a horrific stench and a swarm of flies flying out. I called my brother's name. Ryan? Again, I was met with silence. At this point, the buzzing was deafening. Finally, once I reached at the bottom of the stairs, I shined my phone light. What I saw will haunt my mind forever. Sitting on a computer chair was my brother. He was completely infested. His eyes were red and bloodshot, with parasites swimming in them. He was naked, covered in deep, bleeding, open wounds filled with squirming maggots. Worms and larvae crawled throughout his body and underneath his skin. Flies swarmed the room and landed all over him. His light brown hair had grown long and messy, covered with insects. On a desk near his bed were containers I had seen. They had contained the insects he had brought down there. He had been eating them to ensure his survival. I approached my brother. He was unmoving. His chest, however, was still rising and falling. Suddenly, he spoke. "Alex." I stuttered a reply. "Yeah? Ryan?" He spoke quietly and eerily calm, his voice a rasped whisper. "Do you think Mom and Dad will finally care about me again?" It was at this moment where everything finally made sense. Ryan had felt abandoned since my diagnosis. It only worsened as my parents both started working longer hours too. And now here he sat, infested and dying, having just a sliver of hope that his parents would finally have a reason to give him attention. Tears were falling down my face now. Of course they will. Barely 20 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. My parents rushed home from work and couldn't stop sobbing once they saw Ryan in his current state. He was rushed to the hospital and died an hour later. He had gotten exactly what he had hoped for. Mom and Dad are distraught and cannot stop thinking about him. At first, I felt guilty. If it wasn't for my leukemia, he never would have felt neglected. But then, I felt anger. He didn't have to destroy his own body. All he wanted was his parents' attention. And now, he isn't even alive to see it. Now, as I stand in front of my brother's grave, I feel nothing but pure emptiness. A hole in my heart that Ryan once filled is now empty.